Yes, hello, welcome back to the Rugby League Forecast podcast. And I am going to do the Melbourne Storm 2025 season review. But before I do, I'd like to touch on the fact that we are now officially in the Rugby League season. That was a long off season, wasn't it? Like the Broncos Melbourne Grand Final feels like a lifetime ago. It feels so long ago. And I've got to tell you, every single week I've come in here and I'm counting down the weeks, I'm counting down the days. And now that I know that for the next 35 weekends straight, there is rugby league on Fox League and KO Sports every single weekend for 35 weekends straight, makes me so happy. We have 3 weekends of preseason trials starting this Saturday night. Then we've got Vegas, 3 games on Sunday, 2 NRL games, 1 Super League game. And then it's every week. The NRL Origin finals, grand final, and then we've got the World Cup. It's a huge year of rugby league. And the thing I like about this year too is we know what we're in for in terms of just how long of a season it's going to be, because the World Cup in 2021 was disrupted with COVID. So they actually had to move the 2021 World Cup to the end of the 2022 season. And everything was up in the air whether it was all going to go ahead. But I haven't been this excited for a season probably since 2017, which was the last proper World Cup we had in Australia. I'm super pumped to know that we're basically towards the end of the off season and footy starts this weekend. I'm super excited. One of the things about the trial games too that I'm really excited about is just looking at some young players coming through and just getting perhaps an understanding of where coaches will play certain players, especially those newer coaches in Josh Hannay and um, who else is a new coach? Is it just Josh Hannay? Well, Jason Riles is relatively new. Yeah, well, Josh Hannay is the main real new coach, isn't he? But some of those younger coaches and Benji Marshall and Jason Riles and, I'm really looking forward to what Justin Holbrook has to offer too at Newcastle. And I know he's been around Holbrook, assistant coach at the Roosters, at the Storm, and of course he coached at the Gold Coast Titans there for a few seasons. But yeah, there's so much to look forward to in season 2026. But before um, we dive into the trials and tomorrow's team list Tuesday for the Vegas teams that will be playing in the trials this week. So tomorrow night I'll analyse some of those sides, go through the team lists, go through some of the rules of the trials and what they have to offer. And I always forget with the pre-season trials, the rules, they've got to offload a certain amount of times and they've to get an extra bonus point up the ladder. So it works differently. So we'll go over the rules and all that tomorrow. But mainly we'll go through the team lists. But let's go through the Melbourne Storm 2025 season. If you've been listening to this podcast since day one, I really appreciate it. I appreciate your support. We have reviewed grand finals, NRL grand finals. Not all of them, because I want to leave some for next year as well, but some classic grand finals. We've gone through now 15 NRL season season reviews, and we've got 2 left, the Melbourne Storm and the Brisbane Broncos. And then and then it starts in February, basically, for this podcast is the next chapter, and basically reviewing trial matches, going through some team lists, and also reviewing the games, reviewing all the trial matches, but then also getting into the thick of things, which is previewing the season of 2026. So I'm just going to go basically in the season previews from who I think will finish with the wooden spoon up until who I think will win the comp. I haven't actually done my ladder yet because I've still got 2 season reviews to go. I'm going to do my ladder on Wednesday and go through it. And there's no doubt I'm going to be so wrong on so many levels. And I think that's the thing I love about rugby league is it's so unpredictable. As I said in a previous podcast, I had the Canberra Raiders finishing, I think, third last or definitely in my bottom 4. Yet they finished with the minor premiership. So, that's why I love our game. It's so unpredictable. And I think 2025 showed that it was one of the best years in NRL history, to be honest. Um, so the Melbourne Storm, so they finished in second position. And it's hard to review clubs that are always up there because it's sort of the same thing every year. You know what you're going to get from your consistent sides. The Roosters have made the top eight every single year since 2013 under Trent Robinson, apart from 2016. And then you've got Melbourne, who have made the top eight every year since 2010. And, you've got Penrith. They've just you know what you're going to get from these kind of clubs. So I found it way more difficult reviewing clubs that are just good clubs that know what they're doing, from the front office to the playing group. Everyone knows their role. But the Melbourne Storm, for me personally, um, obviously an amazing year to get to another grand final, two grand finals in a row. Absolutely fantastic. Uh, what an achievement to get to a grand final again. And the really interesting thing about the National Rugby League 2025 grand final was the Melbourne Storm. It was actually that grand final. It was only the 10th time that the Melbourne Storm had actually played with their fully fit spine. So 10th time in 2025. Ryan Pappenhausen, Cameron Munster, Jerome Hughes, and Harry Grant. It was only the 10th time that season, yet they made the grand final. They made the top four. And I think if you're a Melbourne Storm fan, you're probably wondering where that Melbourne mentality was in some games. There was a game that they versed the Dolphins halfway through the season, where they were up about 16-0, and the Dolphins all of a sudden put on about 44 unanswered points. And Craig Bellamy said after that game, he's never actually been involved in coaching a Melbourne Storm side or any game in his coaching career where that had happened before. So at times I felt that Melbourne's identity, their mental toughness may have lacked, to be honest. At times I'd be watching the Melbourne Storm thinking, all right, well, give them a couple of months, they'll go up another gear. The closer we get to the finals, they're going to go up another gear. And I feel like they beat themselves in many ways. I feel like if you watch the first half of that grand final, Melbourne dominated. They were the better side of that game, and they controlled things. They controlled the tempo of the game. And at half time, I was quietly confident that Melbourne could run away with it. But once again, Melbourne, they had so many halves like this where they just dominated in the first half, and then something in the second half would not click. They just would not go on with it. And that's very unlike the Melbourne Storm. But I can't sit here and criticise a team that have made the last two grand finals and three of the last five. Um, One thing I will say about the Melbourne Storm is now that Pappenhausen is leaving and Nelson Asofa Solomona, I think the only two players left from the 2020 NRL Premiership winning side, I would have to say Cameron Munster and Jerome Hughes. I can't think of anyone else that was there. Harry Grant was actually at the Tigers in season 2020. He had that swap deal alongside Cameron Smith. So, I probably, if they make a grand final again, I mean, they're my prediction to win the comp, right, for 2026. If they make the grand final again, then they really don't have much grand final premiership winning experience in their side, but they certainly do have grand final experience. But yeah, there were just times and games where even Magic Round, one of the great games of the year, a Sunday night up at Brisbane, and they versed Canberra, and Melbourne had that game. They had that game, and normally the Melbourne Storm, since 2003 when Craig Bellamy arrived at the club, normally they know how to shut out games. They know how to close them out. They've always had this patience of playing the long game, which I respect massively. And they're quite a boring team to watch at times, the Melbourne Storm, and they were once again in 2025. You know what you're going to get from them, and sure, they can be exciting. They've got exciting players, but the way they play the game, it can be quite boring. And maybe they just bored themselves out. I mean, how the hell Canberra won that? Melbourne were up with 2 minutes and 30 seconds to go. Melbourne were up by 7 points, and Canberra ended up coming back and winning. Like, you never see that from a Melbourne Storm side. So, 2025, I think obviously a phenomenal year, another grand final. But the question is going into 2026 for Melbourne, what damage can that do? Losing two grand finals in a row, it hasn't been done since the Sydney Roosters back in 2003 and 2004. What damage can that do to a side? Because it didn't, it damaged the Sydney Roosters. They couldn't get back to a grand final until 8 years later in 6 years later in 2010 against the Dragons. So there was that period there for the Roosters where in 05, 06, 07, they were probably traumatised a little bit from those two grand final losses. They weren't the same after that for a few years. And I just believe that the Melbourne Storm can come back. I think Suafarlago, this kid is unbelievable. And even one thing I'll notice about the Melbourne Storm, you know what you're going to get from them on the field, right? But you also, the way they bond, the way the teammates bond, they're away from the media, they're from the heavy media in Sydney and Queensland. They're away from the spotlight, and the way in which those players galvanise off the field. So say Suafarlago, who is now going to be the fullback for the Melbourne Storm, you'd think, now that Ryan Pappenhausen has left. Say, he's only played a few first grade games of his career, played a few on the wing for Melbourne this year. Uh, you know, he's a terrific talent, but it's the way in which he's able to just be so happy at the club and not get much game time at all. To be so close with the boys. You see Melbourne in the sheds. Everyone is united, whether they've got a jersey or not. Everyone at the club, from coaching staff to management to the board, to, front office. You see everyone there in the huddles after the games, and they sing that Melbourne Victoria, we're the greatest team on earth. Woo! Something like that. But sorry, I got carried away there. It's a very catchy song. Um, but yeah, there's just you see that, and it's you see teams win games, and you see uh, just the players where just in a huddle celebrating the team song, but. Melbourne just have this huge circle of just holding each other's by the arms and just linking arms and singing this song, and there's probably 40 or 50 in the huddle every single time after a song, which goes to show that everyone at the side, everyone at the team are united, and there's just this sense of everyone's on the same page, and that's what Craig Bellamy has created. And just seeing Farlow go through the 2025 season just feel so happy yet not get overly much game time. Like, he's not 18 years old. I think he's around 23, 24 years old. So he's been around for a few years, and he's had to wait behind, the likes of Ryan Pappenhausen and Nick Meaney. He's probably the third choice fullback as of last year. But reports are he'll start the season at fullback for 2026. And I think he deserves to, because I could, so many players just sort of shrug their shoulders and want to get a release from clubs when they can't see an opportunity within the next few years. And so far, Logo, he didn't know that Ryan Pappenhausen was going to wrap up, yet he was just there, a local Melbourne junior, a local kid that obviously just loves the club and wants to play for them. I just think he's going to be outstanding in 2026. Suafar Logo. I genuinely think he'll end up being the premiership winning fullback of the 2026 season. Bold call, early crow, sound the crow. But honestly, it is just, this kid is just unbelievable. A bloke that just, doesn't have that ego that a lot of players have. He just has this sense of respect from the players around him. And I just think the Melbourne Storm, that's what they're built on. It's not just what they can do on the field and be consistent, but there's just this united sense that's happening within the club, and that's why I think they'll be up there again in season 2026. But 2025, you can't say it was a bad year. You can't say it was a failure. I felt that they just they never really got to the next gear that I expected them to get to. All year I was going, oh no, they'll be back. They'll play better than this. They'll go up a gear. They'll take it more seriously. And they never really improved overly much. I felt they never really just went from gear. They never just went from the gears didn't change. That's what I'm trying to say. I didn't know where I was going there for a second, but they just did not change. They just stayed in the same way where they'd be phenomenal in one half of the game, and a lot of games they were phenomenal for 60 minutes a game. But I've got to be honest with you, there weren't overly many games where they were great for 80 minutes that I can remember. Even round one against the Parramatta Eels, they smashed the Parramatta Eels by 50 points or so. I think it was around 56 points to 6 or something. But even in that second half, in that final 30 minutes of that game, they were really poor. And normally you just see Melbourne run away with it, no matter what the score is, no matter what. They just somehow find a way to win. And at times this year, there were games that they would normally be able to find a way to win, and they didn't do it. So that was an issue going into the grand final. That's something that I was worried about. I did actually think they would win the grand final. It goes to show how good my predictions are. But I just felt that they never just sort of got to the next level when they needed to. And as the season went on, every time I'd look at the coaches box on Fox League, and you'd see Craig Bellamy, and he looked more and more stressed as the season went on, because he knew that they were nowhere near where they needed to be at to win a comp. Like, he knows how to win a comp, Craig Bellamy. 2012, 2017, 2020 premiership winner. And, as a head coach. And like, he just, when you're seeing him in round 27 against the Broncos, barking orders like he was. You see it all the time with Craig Bellamy, but at that stage of the season, I get the sense he does relax a little bit. He still yells and blows up in the coach's box, but there's a sense of calmness around him. I didn't sense that this year when I watched Craig Bellamy in the coach's box, in terms of, you know, he was really worried about how far behind he thought that they were. You could tell in his face and his reactions that he thought at the start of the year that Melbourne would have been better than what they were going into round 27. And I think he was extremely concerned that they were nowhere near the level. And I talk in this podcast about the ability of certain players and certain teams to be able to adapt on the run and change from a game plan A to a game plan B. But I just feel they didn't do that. I feel like they really struggled to adapt to a new game plan when things didn't go their way. If there was a certain amount of points scored against them, then their body language is down a bit, and they lost confidence very quickly, which you don't normally see from the Melbourne Storm side, yet they made a grand final. So it goes to show how incredible the club is. I just think they're a phenomenal side. The Melbourne Storm, they'll be there again in 2026, without a doubt. I just think Pappenhausen, for me too, I thought he was actually quite poor. I've got to be honest. I thought it was one of his off years in rugby league, and obviously he came back from 2 years out of the game pretty much, and he still scored amazing tries. Still had his moments, as we all know, but I just felt like he'd lost a little bit of speed and spark, to be completely honest, and I felt like he was just totally inconsistent. I felt that sometimes he was just rattled. So there was that game against Cronulla, against Ronaldo Mulatalo, and Ronaldo got in the face of Ryan Pappenhausen, and he affected the way Pappenhausen played. And I feel like Pappenhausen was just inconsistent. He was in and out of games. He wasn't heavily involved, considering the other years he's been really good in. A terrific player, and taking nothing away from Pappenhausen, but I just felt at times when Melbourne really needed him to step up and shine as one of the experienced players and leaders, and only premiership winners from that 2020 side still remaining in the side in 2025. I just felt when Melbourne needed experience, when they needed that leadership, Pappenhausen went missing at times. If you're a Melbourne Storm fan and you totally disagree with me, please let me know in the comments, and I'll take that on board. But it's just my personal opinion. I just felt at times he was a bit disappointing. And, mind you, after round 27, we know now on his podcast with Cameron Munster and Jerome Hughes that he had huge doubts. He had a lot going on in his head with the HIA stuff of, really considering giving up the game, which he has done now. So maybe there was a lot more going off the field than what we thought. And, it wouldn't surprise me, just in terms of the way in which he played some games. I felt he just went missing. But in saying that, I still think he's one of the best fullbacks that rugby league has seen in a very, very long time. I genuinely believe that. So he's a massive loss to the NRL, and a massive loss to the Melbourne Storm. I think he's a big loss to them, but I still think that Su'Afalago, I think he, honestly, I think he's going to end up being just as good. I really do. I think there's something about this kid that I don't know what it is. I think it's his attitude, which will get him a long way, but it's also the way he can move and involve himself in the games. Like as I mentioned earlier on in the podcast, he played on the wing, yet when he did play on the wing for those few games this year before he got injured, he just got so heavily involved. He was so involved. He reminded me of Jai Gray at fullback, where sure he plays at fullback, wears the number one jersey, but he was just involved in every set. He was so heavily involved. Uh, and he wanted to be involved. And there was a real attitude adjustment from South Sydney this year based on what this little kid, Jai Gray, can do from the back and, bleeding for the jersey and taking no chances. And I feel like Farlago has the same outlook on rugby league. I feel like his attitude was absolutely phenomenal. Stefano he was good this year. He was good in 2025, but I thought his final series was fantastic. Nelson Asofa Solomona, I think it was probably a good time to let him go. Sure, he can offer a lot on the field, but discipline-wise, he let them down again in 2025. Trent Lorero, I thought he's a good player, but I feel like his discipline as well can let them down, such as that Melbourne Storm game in Magic Round. He gave away a penalty and they ended up winning the game, and Canberra ended up winning the game, and that Eli Katoa was a huge loss. But for me, he was absolutely by far Melbourne's best player in 2025. Eli Katoa was unbelievable. And if Melbourne win that grand final against the Brisbane Broncos, Eli Katoa for me is without a doubt the Clive Churchill medal winner. I would go to say is it's the best grand final performance we've seen from a back rower in NRL history. And a back rower in Luke Lewis won the Clive Churchill medal in 2016. Yet I think Eli Katoa's performance in that grand final was absolutely fucking unbelievable. And he's going to be missed. He really is going to be missed. But Melbourne just have this system where they have the ability to bring up Jack Howarth as well. Like he can move into the second row and replace Eli Katoa if they really wanted to. But yeah, he was injured as well for a large portion of the season. Jack Howarth and Nick Meaney, I thought with the Melbourne Storm too. Defensively, they're normally very strong, but I've just felt their edge defense was quite weak at certain points of the year. Their edge defense really struggled at times, and unfortunately, it was on Nick Meaney's side a lot of the time. I feel like Jack Howarth had a few defensive issues last year, but really improved on his defense in 2025. But on Nick Meaney's edge, there were a lot of points leaked on his side. So that's something that they're definitely going to have to work on, because it hasn't been many games or many years at all where I've seen a Melbourne defensive line look quite weak, especially on an edge. Normally they've always had amazing centres, Will Chambers, Greg Inglis, Israel Folau. They've always had these incredible centres that just have always been incredible defenders, but it is a problem for them. I do think it's one that they can work on though and sort out. But that's the Melbourne Storm 2025 season review. I mean, if you're a Melbourne fan, you've got to be proud. You've just got to be absolutely proud of what this club continues to achieve every single year. And I know we talk about the Penrith Panthers being the best club that the game has ever seen, best team the game's ever seen from 2021 to 2024. And I think that's a fair call. I think that, if they're not the best, they're definitely up there in the top 2, top 3 teams we've ever seen. But this Melbourne Storm club, I would say, would be one of the most successful clubs we've seen in rugby league, just in terms of their consistency. Finals every year, bar 2010. And look, I understand they were over the salary cap from 2005 to 2010. But I think it was 05. Please let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. But I think they started going over the cap in 05. And I just think, the Melbourne Storm, they just are consistent. And I think in 2025, even though they made the grand final, at times they were inconsistent. And I think that's what let them down at the end of the day. But if you're a Melbourne Storm fan, if you're a rugby league fan, you have to look up. You just have to respect and look up to what they do at that club. And I'm a Manly fan. I fucking hate the Melbourne Storm, but I respect them so much. Like I genuinely, I never want to see Melbourne win. I just don't. I'm a Manly fan. There's that rivalry. But if I take my Manly hat down, if I take my Manly hat off and I just see it from a different perspective, a different lens, and I have to be honest with myself when it comes to rugby league, now that I'm doing a podcast, you just have to respect what they've done. Like to climb back after 2010 and win a comp 2 years later, that's fucking brilliant coaching. Yes, sure. Bellamy had Smith, Slater, Cronk, but there's just been this incredible consistency, which is just so rare. Normally we see sides have a premiership window. I feel like Melbourne's premiership window has been open since 2006 to now, which is just 20 years of just consistent success, where there's a real trust between the players, the coaching staff, and the supporters. I really believe the supporters know what they're going to get out of the Melbourne Storm when watching their team, and that is to make sure that if they don't win the grand final, they're going to be proud anyway. And I feel that Melbourne do that for their fans. They're not perfect every year, the Melbourne Storm, but they get it right most of the time. And as a rugby league fan, as much as I don't want to see them win because I'm a Manly fan, go Manly, 40-0. But in saying that, I respect. I love the game so much. I just respect rugby league, and Melbourne are a big part of rugby league. Their success is a huge part of what I grew up watching in the NRL. They were just always at the top and always the ones you wanted to beat. So you've got to respect your rivals, I reckon. So that's the Melbourne Storm 2025 season review. Tomorrow I'll be doing the Brisbane Broncos season review. They ended up winning the premiership. Another side I do not like, but you've got to respect what they've done. Fucking incredible what they achieved last year. One of the great grand final wins in NRL history, in my opinion. The comebacks against Canberra, and then Penrith in the prelim, and then to come back, they were down by about 12 or 14 points against the Melbourne Storm, and then they came back and ended up winning that. So absolutely unbelievable. I'm looking forward to doing that tomorrow. Stay tuned on the Rugby League Forecast podcast over the next month. As I mentioned earlier, there will be team lists, trials, reviews, going through the games of the trials, talking about some young guns at each club going through as well. And then, of course, I'll be doing my 2026 season preview. We are now, ladies and gentlemen, 4 weeks away from the NRL season kicking off, but trials start this week. And Rugby League is back for 35 weekends straight. Please stay listening to this podcast. This is your podcast for the 2026 season and beyond.